Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Lawrence Wilkerson. Lawrence Wilkerson is a retired United States Army colonel and former Chief of Staff to United States Secretary of State Colin Powell. Since his retirement, he has been a well-known critic of American foreign policy. Colonel Wilkerson, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Good to be back with you.
Let's start with Gaza. The thing in the news is that the IDF has now formally given a 10-hour pause for humanitarian aid to go into Gaza. But they are still killing people. Al Jazeera says that they have killed at least 41 people since the dawn, and the night is still due. And meanwhile, the military is pummeling Gaza. My own sense is that they are trying to push more and more people from central Gaza, the Gaza city and Deir el-Balah, into the south, but not even the whole of south. They are pushing more and more people into Al-Mawasi in the coast, eventually to strand more than 600,000 people, maybe eventually all of 2 million people, to be either pushed elsewhere or just strand there to live as prisoners for the rest of their lives. What is your sense of what's going on in Gaza in the ground?
Well, if the IDF had its way, they'd push them into the sea and let them drown, all of them. That's my appreciation of it. I've received in the last 72 to 96 hours reports from people on the ground in Gaza confirming some very strong suspicions I already had. For example, one of them is, and this comes from American military officers who were in the area associated with USAID and associated with other humanitarian organizations, including the UN. And they said to me, and they said in writing in some cases, they had never seen anything like this in their lives. To watch people in hordes who are starving. I mean, you can tell they're starving, and who are so thirsty that they would drink the mud out of the street, come to a place where they think there's aid with their bowls stuck in front of them, ready to get that aid, and be shot mercilessly in great numbers right in front of these people's eyes was stunning. They had never seen anything like this before. Not only that, doctors were saying, doctors from Les Médecins Sans Frontières and other organizations, some associated with the UN, that it looked now like they were patterning their rounds, their rifle rounds. They were shooting them in the arms, shooting them in the legs, shooting them in the head, and then ultimately shooting them in the testicles with great joy that they were able to do this, pick out the exact spot they were going to shoot these people while these people were looking for food and water. So these reports that have come back are, I must say, they confirm some strong suspicions I already had. But this is probably the greatest humanitarian disaster in my lifetime, and I'm 80 years old. It's incredible what's happening. And it's becoming more and more revealed in this country. It's getting more and more people angry about it. And I think that's true across the globe. I did a podcast a couple of days ago with Ireland, and they were very interested in the Gaza situation in the sense that I'm just describing. Very much so. Their parliament and parliament members, you may have heard some of them have given pretty good speeches on it, pretty good talks on it. But they're the other way on Ukraine. So that podcast was to disabuse them, perhaps, of some of their clinging to the Ukraine situation, like the rest of the EU. But I found there was a deep appreciation for what's going on in Gaza. And if you know anything about the troubles in the Irish people, you know that they've had their own problems in this regard. But I don't think anyone, perhaps no one since Hitler and Auschwitz and Dachau and other concentration camps, has done this sort of thing in a way that finally gets to the people of the world and says what it says about the state that's doing these things. So Israel is a pariah state right now. I don't even think it deserves the title of state. It should be summarily dismissed from the United Nations as a first step. And what the criminal court, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court are trying to do, which the United States just abysmally is trying to halt, ought to be forwarded. They ought to go ahead and do what they need to do. This state needs punishing. This state needs punishing badly. But the first thing that needs to happen is it needs to stop what it's doing right now. I don't for a moment think that's going to happen, because its benefactor, its main supporter, its backstop, if you will, for power and money and such is the United States. It's the empire. I do hear, and from reliable sources, that Donald Trump is angry. He's angry first and foremost about Israel's incursions into Syria. But he's also angry about Netanyahu not listening to him with regard to what's happening in Gaza. And he's getting an earful from the Emirates, from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt. So I think he's beginning to understand somewhat the depth of the tragedy that's going on in the region, and bringing some pressure to bear on Netanyahu. But so far, I don't see a whole lot of results other than these, oh, we're going to have a humanitarian period. Oh, anyone who wants to fly an airplane over and drop parachutes with food can do so. Well, at the same time they're doing that, of course, they're stopping the latest ship that was coming with humanitarian supplies and imprisoning, or at least taking into custody, the people on the ship. So, Netanyahu seems to be unstoppable in his, I don't even know what to call it anymore, murders. And of course, the totals are just obscenely wrong. You get these figures of 50 to 60,000. We know now that the figures are well over 200,000. 200,000 people dead, probably 50% of that women and children. This is unconscionable, and yet it continues.
Just to put in perspective, the firing done by the GSF, IDF in the name of aid, 1,000 people have been killed. Just to put that in perspective, that is more than the number of civilians killed by Hamas during October 7. I mean, I think this is something that people should take a pause and soak in a little bit.
I think so too.
Yeah, and the blockade since March, when the ceasefire was torn apart by Israel, the starvation is extreme. I mean, Liz Elok, the head of the protection of Medicaid workers, she went there for the ninth time, and she reported from the Gaza city saying she has never seen so many people begging in the street with hands on mouth, asking for food. And I know a little bit of that growing up in India and living in India, how revolting it is to see people begging for food. And you must be knowing a little bit of that as well in the United States. That happens, not in the scale of what is going on in Gaza or in India, but it's a terrible thing. And now that the trucks are moving in through Zakim in the north, most likely from Jordan, carrying food aid, we have now reports about people jumping onto these moving trucks. And where they were asked about why they are doing that, they said that they have no time to wait for the trucks to stop at the warehouses because their families, children and women and themselves, haven't eaten for days. It's beyond description.
It is.
I
It
wanted
is. I had doctors tell me, we had a little rally on the East lawn of the Congress a couple of days ago, and we had Doctors Against Genocide there, a number of other organizations. I've been working with Doctors Against Genocide since they first tried to get into the Congress and were accosted by the Capitol Police, and almost didn't even get to go see anybody because the police were going to put them all in plastic handcuffs and march them off. We managed to stop that at least. But they tell me that some of these people have not eaten in such a long time that they are losing their mental capabilities to deal with life. They can't be saved by being fed because they are incapable of resurrecting biologically their bodies. They've been starved for so long, and that is just absolutely horrendous to watch. A person who can't even eat or drink water because they're gone. They're literally gone, just waiting to die. And how many of these people they've encountered. And these doctors have been in and out of Rafah and Khan Yunis and places like that almost since the beginning of this Holocaust. And they still say they're seeing things they just can't believe. One doctor told me about a drone that hovered into the surgical ward, such as it was. Hard to call it a surgical ward, but they did have a stainless steel table and a white cloth across it, and they were working on a young baby. And the drone hovered over the table, looked at the baby, consulted some mosaic intelligence Palantir planted into it probably, and then zapped the baby, killed the baby, and turned around and looked at the doctors like it was going to kill them too. And of course they were frightened. But that's what they're living with. This is horrendous what's happening.
Quite parallel to all these talks about humanitarian aid is this talks about ceasefire. And we have been getting quite inconsistent things coming out of Washington. I mean, one day they would say that, well, the prospect of talks are over because we are very angry with Hamas, who would not accept releasing of prisoners. The other day, next day, I think the latest was yesterday when Marco Rubio said that we are very close now to a ceasefire, apparently indicating that Hamas might be amenable to releasing the prisoners. While all of these talks don't talk about permanent ceasefire, and they continue to repeat this nonsense of disarming Hamas. I mean, one can talk about international sanctions for Hamas if they are to break, let's say, the 67 borders within the international norm. But to talk about the Palestinian statehood on one hand, which the French and the English and the others are now talking about. So on one hand, there is this talk about granting Palestinian statehood. On the other hand, you are asking them to surrender their weapons. I mean, how does it make sense? What does it mean? Because we thought that having a state is having a military. What are your thoughts about this? This what boggles me, what I've never been able to understand.
I think the ceasefire dilemma, if that's the right phrase for it, is caused by Bibi Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu looks at the situation in terms that are very personal. They're personal in a political sense. That is to say, he must keep his coalition together, and the extreme right wingers in that coalition will not let him back off, not let him achieve a ceasefire, even as some of them have said, to get the hostages back. It's not a deal they want to do, and they'll walk if he affects some sort of deal like that. So he's the real impediment to a ceasefire. There's another reason he's an impediment. He's very eager to go back to war with Iran, but he's not very eager to go back to war with Iran if the United States is not promising that they will follow, because he knows he's going to lose. He was proven that in the 12-day beautiful war. It was anything but beautiful for Israel. It was devastating for Israel, psychologically and materially. They took a shellacking. They go back to war without the United States, and maybe even with the United States, depending on what that means. They're going to get defeated, and Iran's going to wreak its vengeance on them. So he's not got that lined up yet. So he's got to continue to use the Gaza conflict to keep himself in power. So he is the number one obstacle to a ceasefire. I think Witkoff has told Trump that. Now, what Trump is going to do about it is another matter altogether, because Trump seems to be incarcerated by the billionaires who have him, on a chain and won't let him back up. But I do think there is increasing chance that he might take more adamant action with respect to Netanyahu, and particularly with respect to a ceasefire. It isn't Hamas's fault, in other words. It's Netanyahu's fault. It's what Netanyahu wants.
Of course, yeah. No, Hamas definitely wants to have a ceasefire. There is tremendous pressure on Hamas from Palestinians themselves. But I guess this idea about Hamas having to surrender is almost akin to saying that the Iranians have to give up on their ballistic missile programs if
Yes.
there has to be a talk. I mean, and then parallelly you talk about granting statehood to Palestine. I mean, it's just, and the liberal press, which I thought have been supporting the two states under the 67 border, they never critique this idea that Hamas should surrender and that should be a clause within the ceasefire talks. I think as long as you keep holding to that clause that Hamas should surrender if there should be a permanent ceasefire, we are not getting any ceasefire in a meaningful sense. I mean, that's what I see to be the case.
I think that's fairly accurate. And I would add that the Arab states, as far as I know, Riyadh in particular, Qatar in particular, have said if there's no two-state solution, at least looming somewhere out the distant horizon, we aren't with you. And you can't resurrect the Abraham Accords. You can't do anything that we were involved in because we need to have an idea in our heads that there's a viable plan for a two-state solution out there somewhere. Doesn't have to be next week, but it's got to be out there somewhere. At the same time, you have the need, as I said, of Netanyahu to continue the war. Now, your comment about the liberal media or the liberal side, if there is even such a thing in Israel, to me has come to a head with I read Haaretz every day, virtually, sometimes twice a day. I don't even read them anymore because they are not recognizing the true dimensions of this conflict. I mean, they put these stories in there that say this and that that's negative for Netanyahu or negative for the entire government or the Knesset or whatever. But if you look at their editorial policy and you read closely, they're kind of like J Street in this country. I've always thought J Street in America was APAC light. In other words, the Israelis are smart. They're very smart. They APAC one day might crash and burn. We need an alternative. So they've got this J Street group, Jeremy Ben-Ami runs, and that group pretends to be more liberal. But if you really parse it, I'm not so sure they are.
That's
The
true.
soft side of APAC.
Absolutely. And I guess you were right about the pressure on Netanyahu's coalition to keep the war. I mean, New York Times, of course, has come out with this detailed investigative report about how the far right actually hijacked a plan for a more meaningful ceasefire much earlier. But I guess this is also very clear when one looks at what is going on in the West Bank, because there you don't have the Hamas problem. And I think 2 days ago they have sanctioned the expansion of settlement at Malia Dumeim, which is this major settlement block, at the center of East Jerusalem in the east, Jordan Valley on the north, and Jericho on the west. And that kind of separates all these cantons in the West Bank, if you like. And they have given green lights to 31,000 building in Malia Dumeim, while the settlers have escalated massively their violence, killing cattle, killing Palestinians, and using the IDF in the most brazen way. In fact, Palestinians there are saying that earlier the IDF used to maintain a facade of neutrality. So the settlers would come and shoot at us, and we could at least go to the IDF and register a complaint. Now they're coming with the settlers and shooting because apparently the settlers think that the IDF is not radical enough in the West Bank. Um,
Right.
and Basil Smotrich has made the czar of the West Bank. So I think the whole picture becomes much more clearer when you also trace what's going on in West Bank.
I think you're right. You have to look at that. And I think that's one reason that Netanyahu enjoys the focus on Gaza. because it sort of leaves him free to do equally heinous things in the West Bank. I understand last week they were burning Palestinian families out of their homes, settlers were. And the IDF just stands there and watches. Of course, they attacked a Christian church, even got our ambassador, who otherwise, a Christian nationalist fool that he is, as a full fan of Netanyahu, but even he had to make some comments about that. The guy actually even went and stood in the courtroom where Netanyahu was being deposed. Our ambassador went into an Israeli courtroom and, brought the influence of the United States into that courtroom. No question that was what his intent was. But even he had to speak out about the killing of American citizens and about the church that was attacked by the settlers. West Bank is as bad as Gaza in many respects, and they're not turning loose of that, and they're not turning loose of the land they've gained in Syria. They're not going to turn loose of Lebanon. I got news for the Lebanese government in Beirut. You are part of Israel now, and you will be until the empire objects.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into what you mentioned earlier about some of the differences the Trump administration might have with Israel when it comes to Syria. And maybe even Lebanon might be part of that. I think as I see it, the Trump administration wanted to bring Syria and Lebanon within the ambit of what it was seeing as the Abraham Accord. So you can think of Abraham too, whether it's formally or informally, and ultimately maybe even indirectly use Turkey to come up with this geostrategic and geoeconomic bloc against, let's say the BRICS, which would include Russia, Iran, even India to some extent. I think that's the sort of grand, division as I see in the region. But Israel, of course, has its own ambition of pulverizing Syria, pulverizing Lebanon, and that might be a piece of contention between the Trump administration and Israel. I don't know how important that friction may be because eventually, at the end of the day, Syrians get bombed, South Lebanese get bombed, and the story goes on. But I'm just curious about how you are looking at this standoff recently in the southwestern city of Sueda, upper province of Sueda, the Druze
Right.
majority city, where there were apparently like two types of conflict. One was the internal conflict, sectarian conflict between the Druze and the Bedouins. And then there is the external dimension where Israel has often, since the time of Ben Gurion, has often tried to use what they used to call as, I think, frontier policy, which meant that the non-Arabs have to be used because the Jabotinsky and other Zionist idea was that the Arabs and the Jews can't live together. So your idea is to make alliance, even with Iran. I mean, and that's why up until the Iranian Revolution, Iran used to be an ally because Iran and even the Turks and the Druze and the Bedouins and the Christians in Lebanon were thought to be the allies as bulwarks against the Arab. But anyway, I'm interested about how you are looking at Syria.
Well, I'm looking at it in a very much more general sense, geopolitical, geostrategic sense, first and foremost. We are trying to stop all three of China's base road initiatives, one in the north, one in the central, and one in the south. The one in the south, of course, is led by, in many respects, Iran, because that's where the railhead is coming on the southern perimeter. Now they're trying to, as you probably are aware, they're trying to develop a route that was used by the Persian Empire and others in the old days, used by the US and Britain to supply the Soviet Union during World War II up the Persian Gulf, a land route. They're trying to activate that one so they can get away from some of this seaborne traffic and the threats to that seaborne traffic, like the Houthis in the Red Sea, for example. But we are engaged in an imperial struggle to save our empire against the East, whose magnet is China and whose instrumentation of that magnetism are these three base road initiatives and all they stand for. Ukraine is throttling the one in the center. We are working with the Ukrainians and others, you may have heard some of the pronouncements from General Donahue, for example, very aggressive statement about Kaliningrad and how we could threaten Kaliningrad anytime we wanted to, which is, you know, existential for Russia, just like U.S. missile carriers in eastern Ukraine was existential and started the special military operation. Now I understand too that we're also agitating in the Arctic. So we have an arc of crisis that we are creating, purposefully creating with our allies, all the way from the Arctic Circle, where China is now very interested in being a player. Russia is already a huge player, the dominant player, given her coastline, all the way down through the Balkans, or the Baltic Sea, down through Ukraine, Azerbaijan and Georgia, where we are
Absolutely.
agitating to overthrow the governments, and on down to the war we're seeking with Iran. And all of this is part of what Trump is maybe a little bit coherent over. I don't think he's a genius in this sort of thing, but there are some people behind him who are not geniuses, but they know what they're doing. Billionaires, for example, very interested in restoring the American empire to its previous greatness. And they're looking at this from the perspective of Syria being a kind of wrinkle they weren't counting on. And they don't know exactly how to deal with it, but they damn sure don't want the Israelis and the Turks engaged in Syria in a serious war. You may have seen that recently Russia notified us and then went down to Tanif and bombed around the perimeter of our troops there. They told us they were going to do it. And well, why did they do that? They did that because we're training terrorists inside that area and releasing them into Syria. God knows why we're doing that, but we're still doing that. I suspect it's the CIA and Mossad, maybe MI6. They all work together pretty much now. But they were trying to kill some of these terrorists as they came out of the wire, so to speak, from the area that we sort of enclose in that portion of Syria. So Syria's a mess right now, and I don't think the U.S. knows what it's doing. You could say that throughout the whole Levant. But Netanyahu's wading into that mess because what Netanyahu wants is water and territory. That's what he wants, water and territory. Same thing he wants in Lebanon. I think he wants a little bit more control over Lebanon, though. Why did we build the largest, most expensive embassy on the face of the earth for the United States of America in Lebanon? Well, because it's not an embassy. It's not a diplomacy place. Oh, there'll be a few diplomats there. We'll put an ambassador there. It's CIA, MI6, and Mossad. That's what it's for. It's huge. If you see the satellite photographs of it, you have to think about maybe Baghdad times three, you know. So it's a great game we're playing, a great game against China.
Yeah, I guess there's this British ambassador. I'm blanking on the name. Who did some investigative exposures on that complex in Lebanon, the so-called embassy in Lebanon. Um, okay, and I think smaller states like Azerbaijan, or even to some extent Armenia now, who are probably, I think recently they seem to be tilting towards Turkey, even if they know that Turkey always aligns with Azerbaijan because they see their future of expanding their influence in the region. I mean, the whole Zangezur corridor. Turkey is extremely invested in seeking more and more influence in that. I think countries like Azerbaijan are playing with fire because they're
I do too.
probably underestimating Russia's resolve because they are thinking that Russia is bloated in Ukraine and so be soft on the southern Caucasus. And we know now that Israel, to the extent that they were successful, did use the Azerbaijan territory to launch those assaults in the initial days into Iran. And Iran would would not take this lightly. And I would even
No,
add that
they're rolling up a lot of those people right
Absolutely,
now.
and now the Chinese are more directly involved in Iran because they have seen this as a threat, and in this case, even India has an interest in protecting Iran's influence over the Zangezur corridor because of India's investment in the Chabahar port, which connects, going through the Zangezur into Russia and so on.
Right.
So I think the West, maybe Turkey and these smaller states, they are uh, underestimating the power, influence, and the resolve of the other side here.
I think they are too. I go back to a historical example I consult sometimes. Our Civil War produced at the end over 1 million battle hardened men. They were all men at that time. They were a formidable army. If you look at the British consul in Charleston, South Carolina, who was commissioned by the foreign minister in Britain and the prime minister in tandem, personally commissioned to let them know what the progress of the Union Army was at that time. And you understand the fear that was in the minds of many Europeans, including the British, because that was 1 million-man battle hardened army, and not a soul in Europe thought it wouldn't be used elsewhere. Of course, we didn't. We disbanded it essentially and sent some of it out west to, kill the Native Americans. But that's what Russia's army is now. It's the equivalent of that army plus. It's battle hardened. Its defense industrial base is unprecedented. I would say the only other one in the world that matches it is China, certainly not ours. They can build so much more war material in a month than we can build in a year. The only country that could match them is China. So you're absolutely right. Russia is not going to stand for this. And once Ukraine is finished, and it's probably going to be finished before the mud comes in 7 or 8 weeks in Ukraine, in terms of being, over militarily, and maybe over for Zelensky, because right now he's in so much trouble, someone's going to shoot him probably. That army's going to be ready to do whatever it needs to do elsewhere. Maybe down there in the Caucasus. So this is not a good thing to be doing. That's why I keep saying we're on the verge. I think we're in the initial skirmishes of a regional war that might turn into a world war.
How much do you see the likelihood of imposing a war again with Iran? Because a lot of people are saying that this is a temporary pause and there would be an imminent war at some point in time. On the other hand, my analysis is that that might not be true given the kind of operation that Israel did in Iran, to the extent it was successful in those initial days, came at the back of a lot of planning and a lot of clandestine operations, the killing of scientists directly targeting their homes, uses of drones and cruise missiles, launched from those mountainous northern, borders of northern Iran and so on. These
By
are
Azeris
the
and
bias
Afghans and
involving, yeah,
others.
of course, and now Iran is pushing out those Afghans and the
Yeah.
Azeris, and what I'm saying is that, and a lot of cyber attacks to deceive the Iranians. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, Israel did get massive amount of beating by the Iranians. I mean, they didn't expect that kind of beating they would get, and it's not just the ports in Haifa, refinery in Haifa, and so on, but hitting deep into their what is the equivalent of Pentagon, et cetera, et cetera. And they were running short of the THAAD missiles. If the Americans didn't support them, I mean, one report says that the amount of THAAD missiles that they used needs 3 years to be replenished. And finally, if you follow Michael Wolff and others who've written books on Trump, is saying that Trump doesn't necessarily want a war with Iran. I mean, that's what he says. I don't know. But if that's the case, then would it be so easy for Netanyahu to drag the Americans into another war with Iran. Also, given the fact that people like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and others in the MAGA base, uh, they might they reacted very sharply earlier in that bombing of Natanz, Isfahan, and Fido. What's your sense of that?
I hope you're right, but I fear you're not. And here's another fear I have. I communicate routinely with Dr. Ted Postol, emeritus professor at MIT, who has done a very thorough, of which I have a copy, analysis of what we actually did to Iran in terms of their nuclear facilities
Oh
and their
yes,
nuclear
yes.
capabilities.
I've read his work.
Yeah, I I think he's right in three very important senses. One, we didn't do all the damage we claimed we did. Two, and in that one, part of the reasons for that is they'd moved a lot of their gear, so to speak. Two, they have a decision to make now. Do they go with the fatwa? Do they go with the anathema that nuclear weapons are to Islam? Or do they go with sound strategic reasoning? And three, they can do that. They can build a bomb now, or 10 or 12 bombs. They can operationalize that bomb on a warhead and a missile, probably within anywhere from 90 to 120 days. They make that decision. They will do what the North Koreans did. When I was in the government, the North Koreans tested, and we didn't even know it. We got seismic readings from the seismic center in Geneva, and we said, wow, these are unusual readings, but we didn't get any other of our intelligence signs of a nuclear weapons test, like we did, for example, with Pakistan and with India. So we put everything in motion. We said to ourselves, they'll test again. They did, and we detected it. And the way we detected it confirmed 95% anyway that they had done one before. So that's what Iran will do. They've learned from the North Koreans. I worked the AQ Khan network. I know how Iran and North Korea were working together underneath the aegis of AQ Khan, though I don't think Khan himself, the father of the Islamic bomb, wanted Iran to get a bomb. I think there was some animosity about that. But the North Koreans, they didn't have any animosity. They were working with the Iranians. They know how to go underground and do a test, and I don't think we would detect it. And then it would be a fait accompli. You know, you want to go on Israel, we'll disappear Israel. You know, it's a small country. Iran's a huge country. As Mao Zedong said about China during the Cold War, you can shoot your nuclear weapons at me. You might kill 100 million people. I'll shoot mine at you and kill you totally. I mean, that you could envision that happening, and I think they probably are thinking very hard about making that decision right now if they haven't already made it, and that changes the whole calculus.
Yeah, have you read today's rep? I haven't gotten around to follow it closely, but I read the headlines that Iran is inviting again the UN-based inspection, and I think it's the same IAEA. So on one
Right.
hand, right after the war, there was so much anger among Iranians in general against the IAEA because they suspect, and I think rightly so, about IAEA giving passing materials to Mossad and helping and baiting this war, and so they were pushed out, and there has been huge debates within Iranian leadership and parliament and so on. But today I read the headlines. I haven't gotten around to follow in great detail what's going on, but they said that we are committed to not building a nuclear
I
bomb,
know.
and yeah.
Here's what I think. I think the president gave a speech that the Iranian people even were angry over. I think the foreign minister gave a talk or two that probably deepened that anger amongst the Iranian people. And I think they're dissembling. I think they're dissembling the same way we dissembled with them, then bombed them and assassinated many of their leaders. And they're dissembling while they cover what they're really doing. I
Yeah,
don't
it
know that for a fact, but I think that they're going to turn the tables on us.
Yeah, if they had to learn anything from those escalation, they should learn how to be a bit deceptive, because the
Yep.
Israelis and the Americans are good at that. I want to finally come to Ukraine, Russia, United States, Europe, and get a sense of where this is heading towards, because the recent reports are that White House is very angry at President Trump. They are talking about imposing 100% tariff and further sanctions if there isn't a ceasefire in 50 days or so. And Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, said that they are European allies, mostly Germany and the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, etc., including Canada, are more interested in buying weapons to subsidize the weapons that would be sent. So effectively, my reading is that Trump is now bowing to the need of the military industrial complex, and it would be the Europeans basically that would be subsidizing. So if you look at the aid, for instance, this is very interesting. The Financial Times covered the aid breakups. All the aid that dried up after Trump came to power has been quickly replenished by the Europeans. So the overall aid has not gone down at all. In fact, it increased slightly, and it's the Germans and the Nordic countries which have kicked in, and they are saying that France and Italy and the British, of course, and France, Italy, and Spain have to do more because they haven't bought enough weapons from the Americans. So what I'm seeing is that European taxpayers' money sent into American military industrial complex to kill more and more Ukrainians and to some extent Russians on ground, where while Russia would be pushing their control further west and west. I'm not sure about to what extent Russia control all the four oblasts, but give me your sense of where this is heading towards.
Well, first of all, 50% to 60% of that aid, quote unquote, European or American or Israeli, American tax dollars funneled through Israel, is going to the oligarchs. It's not going to arms or to the war. It's going to oligarchs. That's how corrupt Ukraine is. And that's one reason Zelensky just disbanded the only two organizations that when I was in the government, we made them set up that were anti-corruption organizations because, frankly, Ukraine was one of the most corrupt states I'd ever dealt with in my life. And I dealt with North Korea. North Korea was a criminal state at the time, getting its hard currency by counterfeiting American cigarettes, including with the tax stamps, and counterfeiting American currency to the tune of $20 billion a year. So a criminal state, Ukraine was worse. So that hasn't changed. It's not a democracy. It's not a functioning country in terms of anti-corruption and that sort of thing. A lot of that money's being wasted. All to say, on the ground, the Russians have maybe 6 weeks, say mid-September, whatever, before the muds come and before the terrain is almost impossible for armored vehicles and such. They have the two major points in Ukraine right now in a cauldron. Their troops are busy closing those cauldrons off, and they will utterly destroy the serious remnants of the Ukrainian army, which is the Russians' objective. Not taking territory, not taking cities, that's incidental to it when it is the territory they want, like the Eastern Oblast, but destroying Ukrainian ability to make war, destroying their military. That is about to happen. It's about to be finished. It doesn't matter what the Europeans do. It doesn't matter what Donald Trump does, short of using nuclear weapons. The Russians have won. That's the situation on the ground. I would
So
say that within
would that come about by any escalation of ground invasion? Because so far, what I'm reading in the mainstream is that they are escalating these drone attacks by the Iranian Shahid drones turned into Geran 3, and then a combination with cruise and ballistic missiles. But the mainstream is not reporting on any escalation in ground offensive by Russia. So
that's because they don't know what's going on.
mhm.
there's
would you
there's
would you tell us?
nobody in
Would you tell us
there's
what's going on?
nobody in the West who's competent to report on what's happening there now. There are other things happening too that are playing into this. Watch films of the protests, which are now all across the portion of Ukraine that Zelensky still has some reasonable control over. Watch the people who are protesting. Look at the 20, 21, 22-year-old young men out there, sharp looking young men, well dressed. Ask yourself why they're not in the military. Why aren't they out on the front lines? Well, they aren't out on the front lines because they're the oligarchs and the oligarchs' families' sons. They aren't going to war. That situation politically is going to destroy Zelensky because these people are the kind of people that I saw when Yushchenko and Timoshenko and all these corrupt people were running Ukraine, and they kept changing leaders all the time because they could never decide who was going to rape, pillage, and plunder the best and hand it out to the rest of them. So that's the problem they've got now politically. Meanwhile, their entire logistic apparatus, the ability to get these weapons to them, the rail, the road network, and everything else is being closed out and will be destroyed by mid-September, if not earlier. Utterly destroyed. Zelensky will run or he'll be assassinated. And then the question becomes who's going to run Ukraine? And what are the Europeans going to do? And what is America going to do? Because we're going to be presented with a military victory by the Russians, despite what we tried to do. That's going to be a dangerous moment. A dangerous moment. Do we actually initiate World War III, or do we back down and come with some face-saving maneuver, and this thing just maybe sit there for 2 or 3 years and nothing is ever resolved, and the Europeans make statements and we make statements? Meanwhile, look at the physical situation of the empire. We are broke. The only way we create money is by printing it. Nothing is behind that money. We are so deeply in debt right now that if you sold the United States, everything in it, you couldn't pay our debt. The world is cognizant of that now to different degrees. The world is moving to take advantage of that, led by China, of course, but Russia's playing in this game too. And we don't have the money to keep this going, nor do the Europeans. Merz is about to collapse. Macron's a dead man walking. Starmer is an idiot who is a vassal of the United States. And the rest of the NATO countries are simply fooling themselves that there's a future based on the empire. It's a big game we're playing right now that is not supported, the great game, as we used to call it. It's not supported by assets. It's not supported by hard assets. Whereas on the other side, China and increasingly Russia, partly because of China, have lots of hard assets. The CEO of Ford Motor Company is driving a Chinese car to demonstrate to Ford Motor Company who is ahead in the world on automotive technique.
We are almost there. The time is almost up, but I have 3 minutes. I like to squeeze in as much as possible. So very quickly, if I can end with one final question, not necessarily on geopolitics, but I'm very curious about your thoughts on um, how does the Trump's constituency, how are they looking at the Trump administration so far? And I'm thinking about the far right, the traditional conservative Republicans. I mean, they are all different. Their goals are different. And of course, there are big billionaires as well in that coalition. But how are these different groups making an assessment of the Trump administration?
Right now, they're frightened to death that Epstein is going to derail the entire apparatus. They're very worried about the Epstein situation because more and more keeps coming out. They're going to try to stanch it with Ghislaine Maxwell and promising her everything in the world, probably including a full pardon, if she will spin the story the way they tell her to spin it. I don't think that's going to work. I think his base even will smell a rat there in a moment. they are going to have to work extremely hard domestically to save themselves over the Epstein affair.
We'll leave it there, Colonel Wilkerson. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Surely. Thank you for letting me come into India.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.